Welcome. Welcome to Birkbeck University of London, and welcome to the School of Business, Economics and Informatics, and particularly welcome to the Lord Marshall Memorial Lecture. We hold 4 memorial lectures annually in each of our 4 departments to honour people who made significant contributions to the college in a variety of ways. Lord Marshall was a very distinguished and very able Chair of Governors here for a number of years, and we hold this lecture to honour his memory. We have a variety of formats for the events that we run, and what we have done with this memorial lecture for the last few years is to let you eavesdrop on a conversation. So we have a distinguished converser and a distinguished interviewer, and we get to, as I say, eavesdrop on their conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce the Master of Birkbeck, Professor David Latchman, who will take us into the proceedings.
Thank you, Philip. As you can imagine, I do get to attend a number of memorial lectures in the college. Some of them are for figures of the dim and distant past, who I only know by repute. Others are for those who I met once, like one of my predecessors, Ronald Tress, who was a master many years ago. But today is, for me, a sort of always a particularly poignant occasion because of the very close working relationship I had with Colin Marshall. It's a great pleasure to welcome Janet and Anna today, who are joining us, the members of the family. And those who had the privilege of knowing Colin know what a unique person he was and how he really understood how to be a chairman as opposed to a chief executive. And I have been thinking of that over the last few days because, of course, yet again, Birkbeck is faced with a crisis. The Brexit vote impacts on Birkbeck in the way that it impacts on many universities, and perhaps also in a different way because our students are often EU nationals who live and work in London as opposed to coming here to study. And the only consolation I have in all these crises that we go through is that nothing can ever be as bad as the crisis where government removed the funding for equivalent or lesser qualifications, as it was called, where we lost 40% of our teaching funding with one phone call from the minister telling us that he would make the announcement 30 minutes later. So it can never be as bad as that. And of course, we got through that with great difficulty, but because we had a wonderful team of academic staff, of administrative staff, and also a wonderful board of governors led by Colin Marshall, who really understood what we needed to do. So that really is why I think this is a particularly important occasion for Birkbeck. I think this is the 4th memorial lecture. We've had some very distinguished speakers and this format that we've now got for the last couple of years, and it's a great pleasure to welcome, I'm not sure whether you're called the speaker or the interviewed or whatever it may be, Simon Walker, Director General of the Institute of Directors. And looking through his CV, I noticed that, of course, he's worked in the household of Her Majesty the Queen. He's worked in Number 10 with John Major, but I actually believe you were also at British Airways during Colin's time there. So a very close connection there. So it's a great delight to welcome you and also to welcome the interviewer or interlocutor, whatever, David Smith, the economics editor of the Sunday Times. Just to remind me, it is the Sunday Times. We have got the Sunday Times strewn around here to make sure that I don't get the wrong newspaper. And of course, a Birkbeck graduate who no doubt owes all his tremendous success to that MSc degree with Birkbeck. And he is the author, I believe, of a book which is called Something Will Turn Up, about the British economy, and were it about Birkbeck, it would be called Something Will Turn Up That Will Screw Birkbeck Over, which is what usually happens to us. So we do continue to flourish. We flourish because of the quality of those who are associated with us, and particularly our students and others. So it's a delight to welcome you all to this Lord Marshall Memorial Lecture event, and to hand over to our 2 presenters to talk amongst themselves.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Master. And it's I do owe everything to that master's degree, and Something Will Turn Up is, which of course is from Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield, is intended to be optimistic. So however bad things may seem, and I'm talking about the British economy here rather than Birkbeck College, they do have a tendency to improve in the end. it's perhaps a good basis on which to talk to Simon. Simon has been in many different roles in the past 20 years or so, all of them interesting, some of them at times of crisis, and we'll meander our way around to talking about Brexit and what kind of crisis or not that puts us in. But I wanted to start with, going back perhaps 20 years, when you were in Downing Street. You were part of the policy unit in the latter days of the major government, 96, 97, quite a difficult time. I mean, did you all know that landslide defeat was on the horizon, or was there still optimism then that things could be pulled round?
Right. Well, let me start off by saying what a privilege it is and an honour to be at an event for Lord Marshall, because he was a huge inspiration to me, and probably the most kind and generous business leader I think I've ever come in contact with. So a great privilege to be here, especially with his wife and daughter. I remember my time at Number 10 extremely well, because I do think that we knew it was coming. I mean, I went in full awareness that we were very unlikely. It was very unlikely that the government could win that election. In fact, they hadn't expected to win the previous election, because I was going into the policy unit, and one of the things I discovered was that in the 1992 election, the policy unit was so convinced that they were going to lose that they shredded all the policy documentation before the election actually happened. So it was something of a surprise that 1992 was a success. I think we really did feel in the last 18 months of that time that there was not much chance. The one person who never gave any indication of that was John Major. He'd always sort of put his arm on your shoulder and say, it's not lost yet. We can still do it. I mean, he was the best kind of general who never thinks defeat is going to happen, even though it's absolutely staring in the face. What I do remember was, which I think all governments have when they're going into that situation, is one, a loss of authority. You'd ask for things for government departments in the year ahead of the election, and often they just be put in the too hard basket, pushed to one side, because you clearly weren't going to be in a position to execute them in a year's time. And that was quite difficult. I mean, a government's authority erodes quite early on. The other thing I noticed was how much our time frames in policy terms or communications terms shortened as the election got closer. When you were a year off, you could think a month ahead or maybe even 3 months ahead. But as the election became closer, it was 2 weeks, a week, the next couple of days, and by the time of the election campaign, it was what's going to be on the news bulletins that night, and that was it. You didn't really know what would happen the next. There was no time to think about tomorrow, and that was very striking and something I see in other governments that are facing an election. I think we saw it ahead, and we also saw it ahead of the referendum, actually, where there was that sense that things are moving so fast you had no time to plan.
And do you give up, you were in the policy unit, do you give up thinking about long-term ideas, or do you still pound away at those on the off chance that you might still be in power to implement?
I'm afraid you do. You stop thinking in that very long-term sense, especially if you're a political appointee, which I was, and most of us were political. One of us was a civil servant. I think he could think that much further ahead. The rest of it was how you can shore up what was clearly a faltering campaign with the near certainty that we were going to lose. But again, John Major lost the election, and one of the things that really struck me was the next morning. What happened if you were at Number 10? I got in at about 8 o'clock in the morning, and within 3 minutes, there was a knock on my door, and one of the uniformed messengers looked at me and said, "Sir, you're invited for coffee and croissant with the Prime Minister at 10 o'clock. And then he gave a little bow and he said, "And then, sir, would you please leave the building by 11:15?
Right.
It was just as if you'd had your hands in the till, basically.
Yeah. This is when you leave the little notes for your successors. And then you moved to BA, and that's when you worked with Lord Marshall.
Yes.
Was it a good time to be working at BA at that period?
It was a bad time.
97 to 2000, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was a bad time when I went in, because the cabin crew strike had just happened. And I think we lost, I think it was £150 million over that 4 or 5 day close down, which was quite a lot of money in those days, and absolutely shocked the airline. He was, of course, the chairman rather than the chief executive, and there was quite a lot of things like this didn't happen when Colin was in charge, muttering around the staff. So that was a tough time. I think we helped. I was involved in sort of brokering peace with the unions, or at least a better understanding with them. I remember seeing quite a lot of Bill Morris, now Lord Morris at that time, who was head of the Transport and General Workers Union, and helping develop a better rapport. So things got better over the next 2 or 3 years. And there were some key decisions taken in a strategic direction, the most important of which I think was that we would have beds in business class, really thought of as an extraordinarily challenging thing to do in engineering and design terms.
BA started that?
BA started that. And by doing it before anyone else, I think they gained quite a significant structural advantage. But look, it was a very difficult time, that whole period. I think the transformation that Colin Marshall and Lord King had wrought over the previous decade since privatisation had been incredible. Hard to believe that you could see any company transformed as much as that. But by 97, there were other issues emerging, and the economics of the airline industry was really bearing down on them.
And were you getting the challenge from the low-cost airlines coming through at that time?
Not quite. I mean, it emerged as I was there, and BA set up its own low-cost airline, Buzz, as a kind of. But while I was working for BA in those 4 years, it came very hard and fast. That challenge, and it meant that the sort of gravy of flights to Europe, which were really quite expensive, went, and that was a huge challenge for the airline. Trade union relations were also a real problem. One of the issues about airlines is that there are about 20 different sort of points in the whole process where a union action can ground flights. And when flights are being grounded for a day, it is a total disaster, because it doesn't just cost the revenues that day. It means that anyone who's planning to fly on your airline for weeks around that, any of the valuable business customers will switch because they can.
Absolutely. And it must be an interesting business, the airline business, because you've got to invest and plan for capacity over the long term, but respond, as you say, to short-term developments. I mean, it must make it a tricky business to be in, I think.
I think it's the most interesting business in the world in kind of conceptual terms, but it's not a great business to invest in. I mean, a lot of people have suggested that actually over history, the net economic situation of the airline industry has been to lose money in total. And I think Warren Buffett once said that if anyone smart had seen Wilbur and Orville Wright at the first flight at Kitty Hawk, a smart investor would have shot them out of the air, because of what the fascination with this wonderful industry, which is so interesting, but the economic challenge.
And then in the year 2000, you got the summons, or I presume it was, from Buckingham Palace to Communications Secretary to Her Majesty the Queen. How did that arise?
I was phoned and asked in the most roundabout way if there might possibly be some circumstances
You thought you were going to
in
get
the eventuality. And actually, the first time I said, no, I don't think so. I'm really not your kind of person. This was from an official, and I said, I'm not a raving monarchist. I'm foreign for a start. I was South African. I lived in New Zealand for many years. Also, this is not what really turns. I'm not that sort of person. And I suppose I was thinking about tradition and the military and all that kind of stuff. But they eventually said, no, you're actually the sort of person we want, because you're not like that, because we are preparing for the Golden Jubilee in 2002, and we want someone to come in who has a very different perspective. And they actually, what happened was the Queen's private secretary then phoned Lord Marshall and said, can we purloin Simon Walker, your Director of Communications? And I think, I wasn't there for the conversation, but I believe he said yes.
And were you being borrowed, or was it understood that you were...
It was effectively borrowed, but in fact I didn't
You
didn't go back, and I suspect that was always... And in fact I saw a bit of Colin Marshall at the end of my tenure, and I think we all knew I probably wouldn't, I'd go on to something else. But I remember when I went in there, Private Eye ran a piece saying that with my record, having worked for John Major and then for British Airways at the time of the cabin crew strike, Britain was destined to be a republic within 2 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, you joke, but this was a time when the royal family was still somewhat reeling from the events around Princess Diana's death, and certainly wasn't as popular as it has subsequently become. I mean, so reputationally there was a job to be done before that.
There was a big job to be done, and it could only be done slowly and sort of painstakingly. And in planning the Jubilee celebrations, it was quite important that you got that right, because we'd seen from the Millennium Night, if you remember that,
absolutely,
that you can't tell the public you are going to have a wonderful time, because they won't. You've got to let expectations be built gently, and preferably around the whole country, and not over-egg things. And if anything, we underplayed what we expected in terms of public response. At the beginning of 2002, I remember The Guardian running a piece saying apathy threatens Queen's Jubilee celebrations, and it was a front page lead sort of saying it will be a disaster, no one's registered for street parties or anything like that. And they came to me for a response, and I said, well, that's possible. It's going to depend on what the public want, and I wasn't saying it's going to be a massive success, it'll be wonderful, because I think that would have been exactly the wrong thing to say. But I tried to steady nerves within the palace by saying, actually, 25 years ago, this is exactly what happened. And by the way, The Guardian ran the same headline then. So.
Sure. I was watching a TV program about the making of the opening ceremony for the Olympics, and how that the organisers and Danny Boyle and the rest of them were surprised by how cooperative the Queen was, and how game she was for that little sketch that she did with Daniel Craig and so on. Was that the case when you were there, or was she enthusiastic about these things, or did she take some moving along?
She was definitely conservative with a small c in her preferences. I mean, I was quite surprised at that sequence. I'm hugely impressed, but certainly most of my look,
it wouldn't have happened 10 years earlier.
I don't think it would have, but I had to explain to the Queen that Ozzy Osbourne was going to perform the Jubilee concert, and she said, well, it's all right as long as you don't let him bite the head off a bat, because remember he did that once.
She knew that?
Yes, she knew it. She was remarkably well informed and remarkably attentive to detail. That was the thing that always struck me.
Was there a performance on top of the palace then?
Yes, the Brian May on the roof.
That was the Golden Jubilee, wasn't it?
That was the Golden Jubilee, yes.
Right, right.
And that was, she was happy, at least prepared to countenance that, which was quite a big thing at the time. I mean, to have the first, it was very moving for those of us who were involved, but to have the first notes of the concert being from the roof, and then a spotlight goes up to Brian May playing God Save the Queen on an electric guitar was quite something. And that night was very special and but it was meant to be symbolic that the Queen was inviting the public into her house. And actually, 20,000 people did go into her house.
And you left Buckingham Palace in 2003. I mean, with the reputation most definitely on the mend of the royal family, that it was quite a good legacy in that respect.
Yes, it was a good time, but I also think the public wanted to have a good time. The national mood dips and then it rises, and I think it had dipped greatly when Princess Diana was killed, and that sustained that kind of downbeat feeling. But the Jubilee was undoubtedly a time when people wanted to say, yes, now let's rev it up, let's have a good time again.
Sure. Now, you moved on to Reuters and the British Venture Capital Association, both of which, I mean, particularly BVCA, at a time when people were concerned about private equity, and that would have fallen into your area of responsibility. But if we could skate over those, interesting though they were, and talk about the Institute of Directors, which you joined in 2011. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Institute of Directors, I mean, traditionally it had a reputation for being certainly to the right of any government, including the Thatcher government, and probably to the right of Attila the Hun back in the 1980s. And under Simon, the IOD has been very different. I mean, you've certainly brought it back into the business mainstream, and one of the things you've been quite concerned about is the reputation of business and business's contribution to society. I mean, do you want to say firstly how you came to take on the job of Director General of the IOD, and what your aim was once you did so?
Yeah. Look, I'd enjoyed my time running the BVCA, so that was one trade association, and I then said I'd stop and take a break in France, actually, for a year, and went there, and then had this call saying, might I be interested in the IOD Director General's role, which had come up. I was, because I saw it as an institution and a platform, but I went in under no illusions that it needed change, and I was quite specific at my interview about that. I know we'll talk about Europe later, but one of the things I talked about was Europe. I mean, the IOD wasn't terribly interested in European institutions, and I was coming out of an industry that was effectively held hostage by Brussels regulation. So I knew we had to change. I was pretty appalled when I got in at a level of complacency within the organisation. And I think it had, I mean, to be frank, I think it had decayed somewhat, actually since Colin Marshall's days, because he was on the council of the IOD 10 years earlier. It had become, nearly 20 years earlier actually, it had become hostage to quite a lot of people who were really quite pleased with themselves, who'd sort of made it, as opposed to people who were trying to make it in business, trying to develop themselves. There were also issues about, there weren't very many women at all. Female membership was about 10%. And without being fixated on that, I thought that was something I'd like to try and change. I was even more worried about the age bias. I mean, the average age was about 65, and these were mainly people who wanted a cheap club in London, and I just felt we couldn't survive on that basis. We had to modernise, and that's what I tried to do. So some of it was quite mechanical stuff, like abolishing the dress code, for example, because you used to have to wear a jacket and tie when you went in there, as with all the other clubs in Pall Mall. And I kind of wheedled that in by saying, well, let's have a trial for 6 months, and then just we ended up, there were a few complaints from the fustier old members. But what that was a way of saying to younger people, startups, tech businesses, you're welcome here too. And that was very important. And so the diversity agenda was quite critical for us. I just thought we had to turn to being something that helped people get on and grow in their business, rather than being something for people who just wanted somewhere to come but who'd made it already. So that was the big important difference. Where we stood on policy issues was also critical. I mean, you're right. I mean, 20 years ago we were to the right of Genghis Khan on just about everything. I'm a complete free marketeer who believes in capitalism sort of red in tooth and claw. But if that is your belief, I think you have a special responsibility to talk to and criticize business when it doesn't behave in a competitive way, when it tries to fix monopoly behavior, when it exploits its position to pay outrageous salaries, when it maltreats people, as in the case of Sports Direct. I think then you've got a particular responsibility to call them out. And that's what I've tried to do. Not all the time, because I think you could get tedious if you were having a go the whole time. But we mustn't be frightened, in my view, to say it's wrong for the chief executive of BP to be paid £15 million in a year in which the company's share price crashed and the dividend was cut. I mean, it's things like that that I think one's right to call into question.
Yeah, and that one, I mean, it's a good example, because I can't imagine the IOD of the past would have ever sought to criticise boardroom pay. I mean, that is a new area, I think, that you've taken.
Yeah.
And that is because you would consider boardroom excesses fundamentally damage the reputation of capitalism, and perhaps affect its ability to operate and to persuade people that it's the best thing for them.
Yeah, I mean, it's always difficult to run any business if people treat you with suspicion, whether they're your employees, your suppliers, or the politicians and regulators who govern your behaviour. So you need to be much more open and reflective about how you are, much more transparent, and that I think is important. But you also have to have a kind of purpose in a company that's about more than making money.
Absolutely. And on things like the 0 hours contracts and so on, you've also been more liberal, shall we say, than I would have expected necessarily a few years ago. I mean,
I'm in favour of 0 hours contracts because I think they give a lot of people jobs who would otherwise not be able to get a job. So I'm not against 0 hours contracts in principle. I do see exploitation in the case of firms like Sports Direct, where virtually the entire staff are on 0 hours contracts. So I think there are points you can call into question at firms like that. But business has to change and adapt to the disrupted economy we now face. The taxi drivers of London are going to have to get used to Uber because it brings huge benefit to customers, but actually they got pretty pleased with themselves and pretty monopolistic in their practices ahead of their coming.
And the reaction of the membership, particularly the older membership, when you venture into these areas, is it hostile, or is it?
It's not that hostile. I mean, you have to try and take people along with you. You end up losing some people, but gaining others. But if your fundamental message is, my job is to look after the institution and the entity, and to make sure that it's still around and still relevant in the years to come, you can't really afford too many people who say, it'll see me out.
Yeah, no, quite.
If your strong sense is it's going to collapse not long after that.
Yeah. We'll talk about Brexit in a minute, but we're in the management school here. What would you say, in all the things that you've done, including the IOD, you've learned about, good management, the way good businesses are run? What have been the essential messages for you that have come through?
I think confronting problems as when they arise and not sort of deferring, not ducking difficult issues. And it's quite often easy to duck difficult issues and put them in the too hard basket. But I've thought about every job I've been in that I would probably have done the same things and probably made the same mistakes, only I'd have done them sooner if I was sort of redoing it. And I think that's true of government as well, that you can't sort of try and fine-tune everything. You've got to take decisive decisions on the basis of your judgment at the time. You may get that wrong, in which case you'll be booted out. But the point is to do it decisively enough rather than letting problems linger.
Have you seen examples where problems have been allowed to linger for too long? Has that been the usual set of circumstances?
Yeah, I'd certainly look at some companies that have sort of decayed when confronted with a genuine structural problem. Trinity Mirror would be an example, and the company kind of drifts until its market capitalization is about 10% of what it once was. In some ways, BHS is another example of that, because the writing was always on the wall for BHS as an entity. It was, how do you deal with that? How do you change it and adjust? And I think they never gripped that problem.
These are businesses which are in a changing market. They have changing challenges, the equivalent of Uber, and they don't respond to them. Essentially. No, that's interesting. And about the sort of ethics of business. I mean, you've presumably seen, business ethics that, of a very high standard, but also some examples where it is not. And does cheating ever work in business, do you think?
I don't think it works because you get found out. You do eventually get found out, and that was always the problem. It's not just a moral issue. Having said that, I actually think the vast majority, the huge, overwhelming majority of British businesses are run by thoroughly decent and good people. Just as I think actually there's not much corruption in government either. There are problems of indecision or of a failure to adapt, and sometimes of taking easy options and exploiting either customers or employees where you shouldn't.
Sure. Let's talk about the referendum. And the IOD took a pro-EU position. Was that inevitable, or how did that arise? Did you?
Well, I mean, technically, we didn't actually take a pro-EU position. We polled our members, and we found that roughly 65% of them want to remain in Europe, but about 25-30% of them didn't actually want to leave. So our view was that we couldn't actually campaign, but we did say to everybody, this is our member view. We weren't out there like the CBI saying what a disaster it would be. We were reflecting our member attitude in that regard and raising questions that they had. I was personally, very, very. I believe membership of the European Union has been a very good thing for this country. I left Britain in the 1970s because I thought it was not much of a place to live, and I think the European Union, the common market as it was, and then the EU, has made a huge difference and has turned it into it. So I'm nervous about where we are now. I'm also nervous about the complete uncertainty of where our economic position, and I think our members are concerned about that.
But going back to the pre-referendum position, do you wish you campaigned more forthrightly, given that it was 2-1 among your membership? Or?
I don't think it would have helped,
No.
because I'm afraid I think one of the lessons of the referendum is that people didn't take an awful lot of notice of business, because business was pretty solidly in favour of staying in Europe.
Yeah.
And in my view, and I did say this a number of times, there was no economic case for Brexit. There was a case in terms of national sovereignty, and if you were concerned about immigration, which I am not, then there was a case there. But the economics, I think, all ran one way, and I still think that is the case, that there are very few business leaders or business voices who wanted Brexit. There are one or two, a bit like economists. I mean, I think there were 8, but
Yeah.
we know who they all are.
Sure. Did that? Do you think that reflected was that a post-crisis thing? Was that to do with things like Sports Direct and boardroom pay? Because that did surprise me as well. That it appeared to work in the case of the Scottish referendum.
Yeah.
When enough businesses said this will be disastrous, then the Scots voted to maintain the union. But this time, I mean, I'm sure it had influence, but it didn't have as much influence. And that was not just true nationally.
Yeah.
I mean, if you looked locally, obviously the first place to declare on referendum night was Sunderland, which has got Nissan 70%
Yeah.
plus for Leave. Flintshire in Wales, where you've got Airbus, a similar sort of vote to
Yeah.
Leave. Swindon, Honda and BMW, all of those companies have made clear that we were best served by staying in the EU,
Yeah.
and all of those views were rejected even by the local electorate,
Yeah,
let alone the
yeah.
national one. What do you think was happening there?
As was the view of the President of the United States and
Yeah,
the
yeah,
IMF
yeah.
and just the establishment at large. And I think it raises a lot of questions about the people who see themselves as victims of globalization, the people who haven't benefited from it in the way that not all of us, but many of us in this room have, who've relished the cosmopolitanness and openness of it. I mean, I think it was very unwise for the people of Flintshire or Sunderland to vote the way they did. I mean, Nissan's got to decide where to put its next plant, and I don't know what the answer is going to be. But so I can't say. I think in business terms, it can be justified, but we need to give attention to what happened. And I suppose bits of the attention I'd be looking at are government putting much more resource into skills, into training, into education in those places, so that those people do feel themselves more part of the benefits of economic growth. But I think there are threats ahead. I mean, I would not be betting that Scotland will be part of the United Kingdom in 3-4 years' time. I'd be very troubled about the sort of funding that Wales and Cornwall now get from the EU. And when you hear the Welsh First Minister standing up and saying, "Can we have all our money, please?" I think the answer is going to be no.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree with that. And in terms of the referendum fallout and Brexit fallout, you did a quick survey afterwards, which was just quite negative in terms of what businesses are expected to do. Is that what we're going to see, do you think, for a while now, that things will be very, very muted on the investment side and on recruitment and all those, planning longer-term planning issues that the businesses have to do? Will they be just not wanting to do that for a few months now? Is that the way it's going to pan out, do you think?
I think it was a bit bleak, that survey. I mean, it was very negative. It said that sort of 36% of our members were having an investment freeze, 25% of them were going to have a recruitment freeze, 5% were going to make redundancies. And people were looking at setting up in other European countries. I think that was very negative because it was the weekend after. I don't think it'll be as bad as that. Look, I think things will stabilise, and over a longish period, the economy will recover. But I think it's going to be a while. And in the Keynes' library, we can reflect that Keynes said,
Yeah.
in the long run, we are all dead.
Yeah, sure.
So you can't say, in the long run, it's going to be all right,
Yeah.
without that qualification.
Yeah, and are members concerned about the just disentangling, or you know, all the sheer headache of relationships that have been built up over maybe 40 years? How do you change those? What kind of trade deals do we get, and so on? Do we still have access for our services to the single market? All those things.
It's just the uncertainty of where we're going to be. You know, one of our members who has a factory where she does quite a lot of. She bought in Estonia,
Yeah.
employs people there. The Estonians produce stuff that comes here, is then repackaged and re-exported around Europe. Well, what are going to be the rules of origin for the things she's bringing in from Estonia? And she wouldn't have that factory if Estonia wasn't in the EU. What are the rules of origin? And then what are the sort of tariff barriers they're going to have, and any other regulatory problems? When will she know?
Yeah.
My guess is 7 to 10 years, and that is an issue. There will be new opportunities, possibly in the tech space, in some other areas where being less regulated will help. But it is a leap into uncertainty, and that's what I think is giving people pause.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sort of saying all that publicly in the newspapers anymore, because I'm saying we've got to seize the opportunities that come up.
Yeah, I think people forget that these, you know, they talk about access to the single market. Well, access to the single market is different from being in the single market, but also people forget these are integrated supply chains in many industries.
Yeah.
It is stuff going across borders back and all the time, and components coming from here and different things from there, and those it will take time to reschedule all that and to rebuild all that, I think. So
you know, your excellent book, if I may give it a plug, which talks about how manufacturing declined from 25% of world production, I think, in the early 50s, tells you quite a lot about how things happen gradually over a period, and how serious that can be. There's one other thing that I am concerned about, which is immigration and our attitude to immigrants. And at a university, it's particularly important to say this, because universities also, you know, as the master has pointed out, are a business. The international side of it is fantastically important. I do worry about attitudes to immigrants, not just students, but the people who come here and work hard. You know, we have 70 of them in the IOD because we can't actually find British people who'll come and clean the floors and serve in the restaurant and do the washing up. I wish we could. But actually the country is now London particularly is quite dependent on those groups.
Sure. And the master will know better than I do, but you know, I've never understood why they didn't take the student numbers out of the net migration figures, and it did so longer. You know, that could have happened a long time ago.
Well,
And
I've been lobbying for that throughout my time at the IOD with ministers who agree entirely.
Yeah.
But the person who blocked it. That's it in a nutshell.
And that was the response you got.
Yeah.
That the Home Office won't wear it. And the President
Yeah.
okay. And what was the argument?
The argument is that fundamentally is that the Daily Mail will say we're cheating.
Yeah.
The Daily Mail will say this is a fiddle. Now, I don't think it is a fiddle. B, if you'd done it 3-4 years ago, you might have had some flack then, but it would not be the issue that it is now.
And the issue it was in the referendum.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I should also say, just to be even-handed, that both parties have been pretty deplorable about it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not as if the Labour Party was any better, because they were perfectly capable of stirring up concern about immigration.
And the people you've got working at the IOD, they must have been horrified by the tone of the referendum. I mean, which was pretty nasty.
Yes,
on
I mean,
immigration.
a lot of them say they're genuinely, personally worried that they're not going to be welcome here. And you don't hang around in a country you're not welcome in.
No. I'll throw it up in a second, but one thing we've had, obviously, just this week is the Japanese bid for the SoftBank bid for Arm Holdings. On the face of it, foreign direct investment was going to suffer as a result of Brexit. This looks like a very opportunistic bid by a Japanese firm. But some people say it's one of the jewels in our technology crown, which we shouldn't be selling. What's your view on that?
Well, I certainly disagree with the principle that we shouldn't be selling a jewel in our technology crown. The reason this country thrives, and the city in particular, is because it is an open trading nation, and it's really important to keep it that way. I don't trust politicians to pick what is or isn't a strategic industry, because that's why France declared yogurt a strategic manufacture, strategic industry when they blocked the takeover of Danone. So I don't like that. I also was worried about the Prime Minister talking about the Pfizer bid for AstraZeneca and how it should have been blocked, because it seems to me the system worked pretty well. I mean, Pfizer bid for AstraZeneca, the shareholders and the board rejected the bid, as is their right. The share price is a hell of a long way below what Pfizer offered, but they're going ahead full steam, and that's fine. That is their right as the owners of the company. It's working, actually. And as you know, Britain owns an awful lot more internationally than is owned by foreigners here.
Sure. And do you think it matters that probably there wouldn't be a reciprocal purchase? If we wanted to buy a jewel in the Japanese crown, we probably wouldn't be able to do it, would we?
I think we probably wouldn't. Look, it goes back to Adam Smith. I mean, I think he wrote about it all.
Yeah. And
one thing all the great economists, Keynes, Marx, Hayek, are all united on is free trade. And how in the medium term it's in everyone's interest, and you may gain some short-term advantage with a small sector by protection for a period, but that's all it is. And the downside of protecting industries that actually, I'm afraid, should go bust, so that the resources can be more effectively deployed elsewhere, is considerable.
It's been quite entertaining to see your favourite newspaper, the Daily Mail, torn on this one. I mean, on the one hand, it's great news that this Japanese firm has got confidence in Britain, but terrible news that they're able to buy this big technology company. But anyway, I'm sure that will sort itself out. No, it's time for questions. If anybody has any, I hope you do. Otherwise, we'll be sitting here embarrassed for a few minutes. So who wants to kick us off with a nice question about anything we've talked about or anything we've not talked about? So please start, and don't be shy. I'm going to have to turn to you.
Well, let me ask you then a slightly technical. Where do you see all the people who are going to negotiate Brexit for the UK coming from? We have no trade negotiators. We have really nobody who is skilled in any of those things. Is that not? Are we going to have a sort of national training school for trade negotiators? How are we actually going to overcome that shortage?
I wish I had an answer for that one. I don't think there is an easy answer. A couple of months before the referendum, Mark Price, talking to us, sort of said that he thought Britain would need at least 1,000 negotiators once if the referendum went in favour of Brexit. And he said he thought we had 40 people who were qualified. And I think that may have been a bit of an exaggeration or a little bit optimistic. So it is going to be a huge problem.
Or is it going to be immigrants who will come and take these jobs and negotiate this for us?
Well,
how will that play?
I saw the New Zealand Prime Minister last week, and he was certainly making it clear that they have lots of expertise in those areas, because New Zealand has been making trade negotiations for 40 years since we joined the European Union, the Common Market. I don't think that's going to be enough. So I do worry a lot about that. But the question of timing is a particularly difficult one. A lot of foreign embassies are making it clear that they can't really negotiate with Britain until our status with the rest of the European Union is clear. The Chinese ambassador said that last week, that trade talks can only really get underway when we know what the UK-EU trading relationship is going to be. I don't see much coming out next year, not much concrete, given that there are French elections in May, German elections in September, and Dutch elections, I think, at some point too. So I think there'll be quite a lot of posturing next year. So there's a bit of time to develop the expertise. But it is just the uncertainty, which is why it's probably not a good idea to trigger Article 50 too quickly, because if we fall out of the EU net with South Korea, then the automatic tariff on whiskey exports in terms of WTO rules is 35%. That's going to be pretty inhibiting to current exports to somewhere like that. An important market, but one I doubt is going to be very high on the government's priority list.
I think it's. I'm sure China would lend us some negotiators for negotiations with China. But this may be an opportunity for Birkbeck. You could set up a new strand of.
Well, we are very entrepreneurial. We have started 130 new programs in the last 7 years. We would be up for it, but of course that takes a little bit of investment. So, either of you want to organise that, then
Okay.
I'm sure we're up for the challenge.
Okay. I mean, it would just be people's luck if we changed our mind halfway through and decided not to invoke Article 50 or something. Do you think there's any chance of that?
I couldn't see it, but I mean, I did notice that Gideon Rachman wrote a piece in the Financial Times saying he did not believe Brexit would happen. He's a very smart guy and a very good journalist. I mean, the fact that he thought it says maybe. I can't see what it is, though, that will turn that.
I think the only circumstances in which it could change would be if people. I think the economic outlook would have to be worse than it currently looks. So a prime minister would have to be able to say it's not in the national interest to proceed with this because and on the basis of what appeared to be a shift in public mood, kind of buyer's remorse, and I think we're quite a long way away from that. I think there would have to be quite exceptional circumstances to
the other
change it,
thought, though, is if the Eurozone
Yeah.
really breaks up, if that is in deep crisis through the Italian banking collapse or something similar, and you do see what used to be called variable geometry, where you've really got a real inner core, which would be quite small, and then a much bigger outer grouping. So I can see possibilities. I mean, I don't think it's likely, but Gideon Rachman clearly does. So.
Sure. No, that was interesting. Yes, please.
Just going back to the arms situation, Hermann Hauser, one of the founders, said that it was a sad day for technology in terms of it indicated that Britain could never really have a truly global technological company of the scale of Google or an Amazon. I mean, do you have a view on that particular point, particularly as innovation has to start small and be incubated for quite a long time over here? Which is what you did.
Yes, I think that's a bit bleak to say it can never happen. I do think there's a serious problem in terms of growth industries, particularly in the tech space, needing to get more capital, not being able to attract capital here, having to raise it in the States particularly, but not exclusively, and at that point the investors saying, the investors in Boston or New York saying, you'd better come here. I think that does happen a lot. I saw that from my time at the British Venture Capital Association, and I do think that's a real worry. And we do need some sort of vehicle, I'm not sure what it is, but that can attract growth capital funding for that community. Because I just don't think it's there. I think government's quite, the SEIS schemes aimed, seed enterprise investment schemes aimed at very small companies are one thing, and there's venture capital trusts and EIS itself, but actually you need something quite a lot bigger. Government has just been historically so bad at investing in things. You just make you think immediately of Rover and British Leyland and so on, which makes one allergic to government having a major role. I wish I could provide an answer to this and other questions, but a lot of them are just so imponderable, and I think that one probably is.
Let's go, gentleman there in the white shirt. Yeah.
If Brexit apart from everything else, there is a hemorrhaging of overseas labour coming to Britain, are your members in the IOD making arrangements to boost apprenticeship and better training for school leavers, not just the university level, but to get better schools, skilled labour and so on, facing the reality that they have trouble finding?
Yeah. Some of them, if they're in appropriate firms where there is apprenticeship opportunity, are indeed focusing on apprenticeships and doing quite a bit there. But if you're talking about, washing up in restaurants or being baristas in cafes and coffee bars, or hospital cleaners, or carers in old age homes, these are not really apprenticeship issues. It is quite a lot of just about motivation.
It's going to be the supplemental thing. Will you get the applicants for the jobs?
Yeah, and that's really the problem. The Financial Times did a story a year ago about this great scandal of a company in Norfolk somewhere that was employing only foreigners to make sandwiches and distribute them around the country, and it looked like a scandal. I can't remember who the politician was who talked about it and said this is a scandalous state of affairs. But actually, when you looked at the state of affairs, the problem is it involved arriving at your place of work at 2 a.m. to butter sandwiches and fill rolls through till 7 a.m. and then knock off. You don't find a lot of British people, especially young people, who go in for that kind of work. You do find Romanians and Bulgarians who will travel 2,000 miles or near that in order to work like that, and that's a real problem, and I think needs an attitudinal shift in this country, and possibly it may go to aspects of the dependency world that we've got. I mean, a lack of willingness to travel for work, a lack of willingness to take on seasonal work. All those rural areas where fruit pickers are employed from Eastern Europe, well, it's because there aren't a lot of British people who will take seasonal work picking fruit in Lincolnshire. I wish there were. So I think things are being done on the apprenticeship front. More needs to be done on the education and schooling front. But a lot of it's about attitude.
And perhaps the interaction of some of the jobs with the benefits and the tax credit system, which makes it problematical.
Yes.
Particularly for seasonal work, I think you lose your entitlement and so on. There's another question behind you, I think. Was there?
Somewhat linked about your views on the apprenticeship levy and whether that's a good thing or whether it will be fully implemented in the way that was proposed previously.
Well, we didn't like the apprenticeship levy because it's not an apprenticeship levy, it is simply a bit of tax, a new tax on all companies with a payroll of more than £3 million, which actually includes the IOD. And for us, it ends up just being just being an extra 0.5%. And that was in a year in which we'd also had the national living wage, which the IOD did support, and auto-enrolment, which we were pretty hesitant about the timing of. But all of that meant that medium-sized businesses in this country, as well as the biggest of companies, but the medium-sized ones, the ones I was worried about, faced an increased wage bill of about 4% plus this year. And that's a problem. And it ends up being translated into other approaches, which is not giving a pay increase where you can avoid it. A lot of regulation has these perverse consequences because they weren't really well thought through.
Yes. You did mention Sports Direct more than once during your conversation. Now, I was half expecting a mention of Lord Philip Green. So the question I've got is, I don't know if you watched the Select Committee performance by Lord Green. What do you think of his performance?
Chatham House rules here.
No, I don't think he's, I think he's behaved poorly, but he was always a bit of a predator, really. We knew that, and he wasn't in some ways pretending to be anything else. He also bought a company that was in serious decline. I mean, he wasn't just asset stripping. He bought a company where the terms of operation changed radically, as I saw when my daughter stopped going shopping on Saturdays and parcels started coming to our door every day, many of which ended up being returned. But something fundamental was happening in the way people shop. So those are the mitigating circumstances that I would cite. Philip Green would say a number of things. One is he'd say that the pension system that this country has is a serious accident waiting to happen. And I think he's right about that. The liabilities of a business like BHS vastly exceed any worth it has. And a lot of businesses are going to collapse. And I see small businesses that collapse because they got a pension, a long-term pension problem. So that's one thing I'd say. The second thing is you can't just flog it off onto the man in the street and say, whoopee, I no longer have that liability. That shouldn't be done. But there are other people I'd blame as well. I'd blame the lawyers and the accountancy firms who stood by the chap who bought BHS, and Dominic Chappell, who had been bankrupt 2 or 3 times. There's some uncertainty about whether it's 2 or 3, but who certainly might have asked some more questions. And instead of who sort of stood by him when he bought BHS. That's an issue. I wonder about the pension fund trustees of BHS. When I was at Reuters and we merged with Thomson Corporation, it was actually a takeover technically by Thomson. I was a pension trustee, and God, we combed all the fine print when Reuters was sold to a company that was actually infinitely bigger than Reuters and very well capitalized. So what do the pensions trustees do? What do the pensions regulator do? I mean, she discovered it when she read about it in the newspapers. That's a problem as well. There are governance issues as well. The chairman of BHS is Lord Grabiner, one of our most eminent QCs, been chairman for 10 years. Why didn't he discovered that BHS had been sold a week after the deal was done because he wasn't on the committee that. A chairman's responsibilities to the company are considerable, and that doesn't go away if it's a private company. So I think there are a lot of questions that need to be put to people other than Philip Green about the whole situation. I'm not justifying Philip Green, I'm just saying a lot of people share the blame.
But his was the, I mean, you referred earlier to VHS as being a failed business, which failed to adapt, and that must be down to him, not spotting the extent to which fashion retailing was changing.
Yes.
And
and adjusting
reordering the
accordingly.
business.
Yes, no, I think
that goes back a long time.
I think that is right.
Yeah.
But it's also the way that you project yourself. I mean, if you are, it sort of worries me that probably for young people these days, Philip Green and Alan Sugar are what businessmen look like.
Yeah.
And that's a problem. It really is, and contributes to the lack of trust in business.
Sure. Okay. I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one. Yes. Yeah. No, please. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'll ask a question about regulations. With Brexit, some people are sort of hungry for some degree of deregulation. At least people are voting for it. But for some, that might mean winding back on workers' rights, and I'm interested in your perspective on that. Should we expect that to happen? Where do you stand?
I don't think it will happen, because I think that regulation is now quite old and quite written into British law. So I suspect that won't happen, or it won't happen significantly. I have to say our members do worry about employment regulation from Brussels. They worry that there's a very different attitude to how labour markets, well, they're clearly right, work on the continent, and that the flexibility that we have here has helped business cope with the financial crisis and helped us gain employment over the last few years. And I think they're probably right. It's a serious worry to me that in places like Spain, Portugal, France, Greece above all, that worker protection is so entrenched that you can't ever make the kind of necessary adjustments. You can't get rid of anybody, meaning that older people stay in those jobs, and you have youth unemployment running at, in Greece's case, at one point at 57%. So there has to be a balance, and many of our members were worried that it was going to go further. And I think they had reason to be worried. My preference would have been for Britain to have fought for labour market liberalisation, that nonetheless allows fundamental protections rather than quit the EU.
Yeah, I mean, one of the greatest frustrations in the run-up to the referendum was that certain arguments were quite difficult for people who were committed to voting Leave to accept, and one of them was that the UK has some of the easiest labour market and product market regulations in the OECD. I mean, we are sort of number 2 or 3 out of 36 OECD countries in terms of labour market and product market regulation. So the idea that there was going to be a bonfire of red tape if we left was always a myth, but it was a myth that some people wanted to believe. Yeah. I mean, Simon's point is slightly different, that there might have been further regulation coming through, which we would have to fight against. But we've been pretty successful at fighting those things. Yeah. I mean, most of the things that Britain has signed up to were voluntary, like Working Time Directive and so on. Yeah. So,
but we are no slouches at regulation.
Oh, absolutely not. I look at HMRC, they're very good at that.
When I went into the number 10 policy unit, we were going to see the chap who was in charge of regulation overall, and he had 2 shelves of his, 2 walls of his office were completely book-lined, and the smaller one, he said, that was all British regulation up till 1979, when Margaret Thatcher came to power, and he pointed at the much bigger wall and said, and that's all the regulation we've had since, and he was kind of saying, from this Conservative government. Yeah. And he was right.
Sure.
The hunch that you regulate to put everything right is still abounds in this country as well.
Absolutely. Right, I think we're out of time, but can we thank Simon for illuminating us with his experience and his wisdom, and give a small show of appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I'm continuing on that note of appreciation. We've been thoroughly informed and entertained, actually. It's a very entertaining conversation. So I'd like to thank Simon, thank David, Simon in particular for taking us. It's a kind of a tour from Downing Street to Buckingham Palace to the top flight of British industry as in British Airways, and contemporary realities of running a very important organization, Institute of Directors. And so we've had, very insightful discussions about what is happening and how the decision-making process at the Institute of Directors evolve and develop. But also we've had a very interesting conversation about Brexit, currently, and what to expect going forward. And very good, very insightful, kind of looking into the future about how things might develop from somebody who is in the know, who knows what clearly he's talking about. So thanks very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed listening to you, and I'm sure that the rest of the audience
Thank you very much.
will say the same. David, this is a masterful steering of a conversation, taking it from one era, one epoch to the other. And thanks very much for guiding the conversation. It's flowed, it's been very, very insightful, and that's clearly in the best tradition of a first-class journalist which you are. So thanks. We're very proud to have you as one of our alumni. Now, we have Lady Marshall here, and Anne. Thanks very much. We missed you so much last year. You couldn't be here, but we had a very good session as well last year. It's been fantastic this past few years, and Lord Billamuria, sang praises of Lord Marshall, just like we heard from Simon and from everybody whom I've had the pleasure of listening to talk about Lord Marshall. So thanks for coming, thanks for supporting this event. We hope that you're enjoying what you've had so far. We have colleagues here from industry, our partners. Very, very grateful that you guys could take out time to be here with us. This is a partnership that is growing wings, and we expect that we'll continue to collaborate. We are in a kind of very challenging, interesting environment. Maybe post-Brexit. Brexit hasn't yet happened, but things are happening, and at times like this, we need to do what? Collaborate even more. So just to say that that's very much open for business. The management department in particular is looking to continue to work with businesses. We have capacity to offer customized programs to address contemporary issues. One of which has been mentioned now. We're looking for international trade negotiators, and it's something that we're going to be looking to put up short workshops on, and to invite industry to come in and have chats and share experiences and thoughts with us. So thanks for coming, colleagues. And I'd also like to thank colleagues who put together this particular event, who worked for it. Day and night, Matthew Jays, and his team, really. So thank you very much, Matthew. This has been, as usual, very well organized. And I know that you've been able to do it with the support of the Dean, with the support of Andy, with the support of the entire BEI school team. And the master is always a very enthusiastic supporter of the management department. And of
You keep making money?
Yeah, we'll keep working on it. So thanks very much. I think I've said that we are very open for business. We're keen to continue to collaborate. Philip mentioned that we have 133 math programs which were set up in the last few years. So please do look at opportunities to work with us, to join us. And the last thing I'd like to say is that if you've been invited to join the master in the council chambers, please follow the volunteers. I think they'll make themselves available as we depart. So that's it. Thanks very much. Thanks for a very wonderful evening. And,